Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited for this webinar. I'm Helen Torres, the Executive Director and CEO, HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. We know we're been joined by quite a few individuals through our participants through Zoom. And then, of course, we are doing this via Facebook Live. So welcome, good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the discussion on what Californians think about race relations and how diverse communities can work together to advance common goals in diversity and inclusion. As I mentioned, my name is Helen Torres. I am the CEO of Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, and we are bringing you this program in partnership with the Center for Asian American United for Self-Empowerment, CAUSE, and the Los Angeles Urban League, supported by the Southern California Gas Company. Thank you for their support. Our coalition of Latina, Asian Pacific Islanders, and African American communities began in February of this year when we set out to conduct a poll to learn more about what our communities in California thought about race relations nationally and locally, and what policy issues might matter most to them during the very early stages of 2022's presidential campaign, if we can all think back that long. We asked questions about discrimination, identity, our quality of life, what our preferences for president would be during that primary election season. We did not know, obviously, that 2020 would be one of the most historically challenging, impactful, and transformational years in our history and our recent memory. With COVID-19 pandemic having fully taken hold of the nation's health, economy by early spring, and the demonstrations in response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others unfolding in the summer, the United States and the world felt like a very different place in June. Thus, our coalition decided to conduct a poll again, this time taking the impact of COVID-19 and our opinions about Black Lives Matters and policing into consideration. In November, we set out our third time this year to ask our communities how they felt about these issues right after the November 3rd election. This time, we incorporated questions about the California state propositions on the ballot and updates on COVID and race relations questions. The results of our three polls have been at times surprising, confusing, illuminating, but most importantly, they are informing our work as community organizations and leaders to come up with solutions that meet the many challenges our communities are facing. Today, we have a historical timeline of communities' opinions and priorities over the course of this outstanding year, and we're eager to discuss our latest findings with you. I am joined by my colleagues in this coalition, Michael Larson, President and CEO of Los Angeles Urban League, Nancy Yap, Executive Director of CAUSE. And we're also joined today by Assistant Chief Robert Arcos from the Los Angeles Police Department, who has agreed to listen to our poll findings and weigh in how LAPD can support our community's priorities. This panel will be moderated by our good friend, Dan Schnur, professor at UC Berkeley, Pepperdine University, and USC, who has been instrumental in the creation of the poll and bringing together this strong coalition among other organizations. So thank you so much, Dan, for your leadership. Before we dive into our panel, I would like to thank SoCalGas for their generous support of our event today and invite their Community Relations Director, Tricia Muse, to share why this programming and research is important to SoCalGas. Welcome, Tricia. Oh, Tricia, you're still on mute.
Okay, sorry. Good morning. Can you guys hear me now? Thank you, Helen. It's an honor for SoCalGas to support today's community poll conversation on race relations in California. Thank you, Nancy, Michael, and Helen for inviting us. Thank you to Professor Schnur for moderating what I'm sure will be an enlightening conversation. And I'm so glad Assistant Chief Robert Arcos from the LAPD could be here as well. Thank you for joining us. SoCalGas has a long-time relationship with the three nonprofits here today. Our employees give back through board service to them, and we've partnered with each to create meaningful programs to help the diverse communities that we serve. We believe collaboration is key to solving our region's most complex challenges: systemic racism, poverty, healthcare, education, and even providing clean, safe, and innovative energy solutions. They're all complex issues that will take thoughtful minds to identify solutions that will serve all members of our communities. In today's session, we'll hear results from a recent statewide poll on how Californians feel about race relations. At SoCalGas, we're focused on championing diversity in 3 areas. First, in the supplier diversity space, where we've exceeded the California Public Utility Commission's diversity goals for the last 28 years, resulting in increased opportunities for small and diverse businesses. And we were just recently recognized as the Corporation of the Year by the Southern California Minority Supplier Diversity Development Council. Second, among our employees, we are continuously making improvements to drive programs, practices, and policies that support an equitable and inclusive workplace for all individuals. Recently, we expanded our dedicated diversity and inclusion roles to better support DEI initiatives, including naming a Chief Diversity Officer. And third, in our charitable giving space, which is the area that I'm focused on, we focus the majority of our giving on underserved communities and Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. We prioritize education, environmental, and workforce programs to help create meaningful change in the communities we serve. We are always looking for ways to improve, and we are honored to support this important research, and we'll be listening and learning here today too. So thank you. I hope you all stay safe and well, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Thank you so much, Keisha. We appreciate your support as we move forward and go on with our panel. And with that, I'd like to welcome to the conversation. I'm going to list out our panelists as we turn to moderator Dan Schnur. Once again, we're joined by Michael Larson, President and CEO of the Los Angeles Urban League, Nancy Yap, Executive Director of CAUSE, and Assistant Chief Robert Arcos from the Los Angeles Police Department. Turning it over to you, Dan. Thank you so much for your leadership in all this.
I apologize for that. Helen, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being with us today for what I believe is going to be, I know is a very important, but I believe is going to be a very interesting conversation. I also want to join Helen in thanking Tricia Muse and her colleagues for arranging and hosting this program. We're grateful of the opportunity to talk about our findings and our panel's thoughts going forward with all of you. What I'd like to do for just a minute or two before we get started with the panel discussion is to offer, if I can, just a few minutes of overview on the public opinion research on the statewide poll that Helen was referencing. So let me take a few minutes on that, and then Helen and Michael Lawson, Nancy Yap, and Chief Arcos will join me for the conversation. So as Helen mentioned briefly, earlier this year, the 3 organizations came together: the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, the Los Angeles Urban League, and HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, to sponsor a series of public opinion polls designed to gauge a number of subjects, but in particular, issues relating to race relations and discrimination among California voters, with a particular focus, and in fact, an oversample in our poll, on the 3 communities that our organizations represent, the African American, the Latino, and the Asian Pacific communities. Now, when we started this, when we began this joint effort, of course, it was before COVID. It was before the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, before the protests, before the presidential level debate about race relations and criminal justice. And so we started out in February polling on these issues on a broader basis. Then in July, we expanded to take on the states and these various communities' reactions and attitudes towards the virus and the protests. And then in November, as Helen mentioned, we focused on the election, primarily ballot initiatives, and what I'm going to talk about for a couple minutes today is our findings on Proposition 16, the ballot measure that had it passed would have reinstated affirmative action in college admissions and state hiring and contracting policy in California. So in our survey, 2/3 of California adults who responded said that they believed that diverse representation based on race, gender, ethnicity, and national origin is important. And almost half said it was very important. Roughly the same number said that they were concerned or very concerned about discrimination in our communities. And those findings were true across all major ethnic and racial groups and among both voters and non-voters. About 6 in 10 white respondents said that they considered diversity to be important, or very important, along with about 7 in 10 who identify as Latino or Asian or Pacific Islanders. And among Black respondents, the share rose to more than 8 in 10. But as all of you know from following the election results, that support for diverse representation and concern about discrimination did not translate into support for the restoration of affirmative action. Among Latino and Latina respondents, for example, only 30% said that Proposition 16 was a good idea, compared with 41% who called it a bad idea, 29% who said they were unsure. The division was similar in the Asian and Pacific Islander communities. 35% called the proposition a good idea, while 46% said it was a bad idea and 20% weren't sure. White respondents were a little bit more opposed. 32 said a good idea, 53% said a bad idea, and 15% said unsure. And only in the African-American community did the proposition get majority support, with 56% calling it a good idea, 19% a bad idea, and the rest unsure. So roughly 1/3 of those polled could be categorized as solid supporters of affirmative action, people who said that diversity was important and the ballot measure was a good idea. On the other side, just over 1 in 5 said diversity is not important to them and that the ballot measure, not surprisingly, was a bad idea. So what we're going to focus on today, for the most part, are those in the middle, those who said that diversity is important, that discrimination is a significant concern, but they felt that this particular approach to discrimination and to diversity might be accomplished through other means. So what I'm going to do now is what I'd like to do is bring our panelists into the conversation. Michael Lawson, Helen Torres, Nancy Yap, and Assistant Chief Arcos. And let's turn this monologue of mine into a conversation. And so, Michael, I'll start with you and ask you the most obvious question from these findings. What did we learn? What did we learn from the defeat of Proposition 16? And how has that affected your thinking on how to best address issues relating to race and gender-based discrimination in California?
Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate being invited to be on this panel once again. This is always informative, and I hope that my words will be informative, but I learned so much from these sessions. So thank you for this question. I will start by saying I'm not sure that we learned a lot from how the voters voted, because I don't think that the supporters of Proposition 16, of which I was one, did a very good job of explaining what the goal was. Well, I think we knew that the goal was clear, the methodology and the need for this tool in our toolbox, and the impact of using this tool. I think that if Prop 209 had never passed and we were having this discussion, I think it would be a different type of discussion. It wouldn't be whether affirmative action is right or wrong. It would be the methodology. And that's really the existence of 209, which was why Proposition 16 had to be put on the ballot, is an additional hurdle that we had to get past. Prop 209 was so long ago, you have a lot of people who don't understand what the purpose of 209 was and how we got to where we are. The fact is that one of the things that has become clear over the last 6 to 8 months is the impact of systemic racism. You hear the term, and people are starting to understand what the impact of systemic racism is. But we didn't do a good job of making it clear that in order to address systemic racism, you need a tool like affirmative action in order to beat back the artificial barriers that have been put in place through the system. So I, for one, believe that part of the problem is the proposition system in and of itself. Another part of the problem is the difficulty of explaining this complex issue in a quarter of a page on the ballot measure, and the misunderstanding of what we expect the impact to be. I am hopeful that what the thing that did come out of this is, quite frankly, more discussion among the various groups that will be affected. And I hope that that will continue, this session being one of them, so that we can have more conversations about what is needed and how we can move to the next level.
Michael, thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. I'd like to bring Nancy Yap, the Executive Director of CAUSE, Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, into the conversation. And Nancy, I know you've spent a lot of time going through the election results and the poll results. And as someone who, like Michael, supported Prop 16, what I found really interesting, and I think our audience will as well, is that you're not necessarily discouraged by these poll results, but actually you see but you see a significant basis for optimism in them. Maybe you can take a little minute and talk about your interpretation of what we've learned and how we can use that going forward.
Sure. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for having me here today. I did spend a lot of time with the survey results. I think we all did. And I know for me, especially in these moments around Prop 16, some of what Michael was sharing around the understanding of it or the history of it. But I also think there were some perceptions that not believing in Prop 16 meant not believing in diverse representation. And I think the data for me really helped us to level set where some of the work and education can happen. And I also think it helped us to also have data to talk specifically about the Asian and Pacific Islander community as well, which I think is a part of the work that we do at CAUSE, but I know is valuable to all of our communities to have that kind of data. So to know that, one, there is a support for diverse representation. And I know in the Asian and Pacific Islander community, we were looking at 75% supporting diverse representation. But not so much that Prop 16 was really that solution, whether they thought it was a good or bad idea versus just maybe not being sure if that was true. So I think this is an opportunity for us to find not just solutions together that bring us all to the table and represent our communities, but also for the API community, we saw there was a difference, for example, between Chinese American respondents and other Asian American respondents, with Chinese Americans 2-to-1 against versus the rest of Asian Americans more on a 1-to-1. And I think that also allows for us as community leaders to tailor our messaging and also have those conversations around what would make these solutions feel like they really fit all of us, or at least heard all of us in terms of what they could be and what they could look like.
Nancy, I think that's a fascinating, and I think it's an important analysis of the results, particularly to begin to think about next steps forward. So what I'd like to do to build on your analysis is to ask Helen Helen Taudis to rejoin us, representing HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. And Helen, when you hear Nancy talk about these next steps, what do you think of in terms of more specific and more tangible next steps forward that we as a range of communities in this diverse part of the world should be prioritizing?
So I think we need to be prioritizing our youth. We all know that the Latino and the Asian American Pacific Islander community is a very youthful population here in California. And solutions like affirmative action to discrimination, to systematic racism in our society are very new concepts to this new generation that either came here as immigrants or for the last 2 decades. We have to remember that it's been over 2 decades that 209 passed that repealed affirmative action. So they never even grew up with this concept of what affirmative action was. So I think there's an opportunity here to really engage our youthful leaders and ensure that communities understand that we do have to take that affirmative action against discrimination, that it's not enough to have discrimination laws, to ensure that discrimination doesn't happen, but we do have to look for solutions that come to the table and reset. And I think Nancy kind of mentioned that word as well, how we're moving forward. And I think that also means to older generations like myself to really create a table in which new solutions come and can be moving forward. I think the next thing is really emphasizing what Michael spoke to is we all can be much better educated about our history, our collective history as United States residents and citizens, but also the history of each of our communities and how discrimination and racism has really affected us moving forward. There was incredible research being done by UC Berkeley of the effect of discrimination within the system, how it's baked in, that really kept Latinas and Latinos and African Americans from competing in key areas such as entrance to university or public contracts. However, that didn't translate to passing affirmative action. And the reason being is, especially, I think all of us were a little bit enthusiastic of seeing coming out of the summer, thinking that there was going to be this big rise up, of you will, of communities because of the marches, that we would be looking for these common solutions. But we found from our poll is that when people were talking about looking for solutions around our policing, our criminal justice reform, it didn't translate to affirmative action, entrance into universities or public contracting. So there's a big lift that needs to happen in our community to educate us about our own history. What are some new solutions that new generation of leaders can put forward? But I think what we also found in this poll is that huge number of unsure is that there is this place for community leadership to start thinking about new solutions and moving that forward. The last thing I will say is that, HOPE has taken this very seriously, and we're committed to not only being part of this coalition moving forward, but we're already working putting together all this information that we learned in this critical year on a web page and really starting to create leadership development opportunities for our leadership programs. And we have it on our webpage called Hope Against Racism. And that's being sponsored right now by Walmart. So we're really grateful to them. But I think it's going to be incumbent on all of us to look at new ways to bring in new leaders to this conversation.
Helen, thank you so much. That is a very clear and appropriately ambitious roadmap for our next steps. So thank you so much for that overview. I'm very excited to welcome Assistant Chief Robert Arcos, the Los Angeles Police Department, to be part of our conversation today. And Chief Arcos, we know how busy you are. We know the demands on your and your colleagues' time. And so we're very, very grateful to have you with us. And I'm hoping that obviously the police department was not part of our polling effort, but I know that you and your colleagues have spent a lot of time not just thinking about, but working to confront issues in terms of race relations and discrimination, both within the department and within the broader community. And I'm wondering if you could provide our audience today an overview of what those efforts have looked like over the years and how they've changed.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to SoCalGas for bringing this great group of panelists together to discuss these really important issues. And I really want to thank Helen for her remarks. I think she really captured the essence of the initial question about the work ahead, especially with the engagement of our youth. You know, I came on this department in 1988, Dan, and I think I shared with you before. I came on during affirmative action, and we were really underrepresented in this police department as far as the reflectiveness of the city's workforce. And what I really learned very early on in my career is that representation does matter. And I think the department has made a lot of great strides in that work. You know, today we are at 49% Latina in the department, 9% African American, but 18% women, 5% Asian American through the ranks here. So we've come a long way. And I think I mentioned this earlier. When I came on this department, it did not look like me at all. So it really was a learning experience about my role and my responsibility in this profession and my connectivity with the communities of color, especially. I also came on the department under the Hunter Lale consent decree to help promote minorities from the rank of sergeant and above. And we have really bolstered our ranks with representation, but that was 32 years ago. And time changes, and we are now starting to see some slippage in that representation of this department. I think really what it's also important to know for the viewers out there is that with this law enforcement profession, the history of policing itself is rooted in beginnings that were designed to suppress and oppress people of color and kind of help structure systemic racism that we are still facing today. And the calls that we have seen for social justice reforms, police accountability and bias, everyone in this law enforcement that I know as a professional really recognizes that as a work ahead for us to continue to make strides towards dismantling any aspect of that in our profession. Under the mayor's order, we have an equity officer on our department. We're taking a look at our policies. We're taking a look at our hiring, our promotions, our training to root out any semblance of structural systemic racism in the organization. It really is a work that every department in the city of Los Angeles has taken on, but you know, we really are proud of the work that we've done in the last 20 years to change this organization to be much more community-centric, relationship-based. Helen also talked about knowing our own history. This department's history, again, especially the Los Angeles department, has a very fragile history with our communities. We've lost the trust a number of times. And I remember in 1992 as a young police officer, how I felt when the city was burning. And I was taken back to that time in May of this year, again, when we had the civil disobedience and civil unrest after Breonna Taylor and the murder of George Floyd in our city. So it's really important that we get back to understanding our history with this city. Our Board of Police Commissioners, our chief, has implemented a training program in the academy where we are going to tell our story, both good and bad. So our officers know this relationship that we've had with this city. And I think that's very, very important for always keeping in mind that trust is very fragile. And as hard as we work on trying to create trust, that one incident is all it takes to lose that trust with our community of color. Lastly, on the point of what we're doing to work very closely again for race relations and rooting out discrimination is this expansion of our community safety partnership. The chief designed a bureau, assigned a deputy chief, Imada Tingarides, who has a very great story of her own humble beginnings, living in housing developments. And again, the close relationships that's necessary to work in our communities of color. So we've expanded that into 9 communities in our city. We're looking to expand that going forward. It really does speak to the importance of having those one-on-one interactions in our communities with officers who look and know the communities that they are working under, and to have that very close personal relationship that helps build trust going forward. There's so many other things, Dan. I know we're trying to limit our responses, but so many other things that this department again is doing to work towards rooting out structural racism, systemic racism in the organization, and externally and internally. So many more topics I hope I can pass on in some of the other questions moving forward.
Chief Arcos, thank you so much. Before we go on to the next round of questioning, though, I wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you a follow-up if I can.
Sure.
We've all been reading in the local news media over the last several days the prospect of budget cuts for the city of Los Angeles and the potential layoff, not just in the police department, but throughout city government. And what I don't know the answer to, and maybe you can help provide us some guidance, is to what extent would these layoffs impact the department's ability to continue to diversify its ranks to look more like the city of Los Angeles?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dan. Great question. I think it has both an operational impact for our ability to provide service and also for an erosion of the work that we have made some great strides on with for inclusion and diversity in the department. We've had a huge recruitment campaign to reach out to women to join this police department. And this class currently in the police department is comprised of all women. And we are very, very proud of that accomplishment. We've also included a very strong campaign again of reaching out to our African-American community and recruiting them in this department. And again, we have the last couple of classes, we've had increased our African-American representation in those classes, as well as women. These proposed budget cuts that are on the floor today would impact that greatly. Those officers who have been hired in the last 2 or 3 years that has been around the work for inclusion and diversity in the department would be the first ones to be laid off from this department. So that would really, again, have a very challenging and shocking effect on our work towards inclusion and diversity on this department.
Chief, thank you very much. And I should clarify for the audience that neither I nor our coalition nor our host is taking a position one way or another on the best way for the city of Los Angeles to balance its budget. But it did occur to me in a context of diversifying the ranks of the LAPD that this was a relevant question. And I hope no one would overinterpret my question as any of us taking a side in a critically important but very, very difficult debate. So Nancy Yap, I'd like to come back to you. And is all of you have articulated, this has been an incredible year. It's been an extraordinary year. It's been an unprecedented year. So not just in the context of Proposition 16, but more broadly, looking back at what we've learned about the COVID and its impact and our community's reaction to it, looking back at the tragedies we've discussed and the community's reaction to them, given so much information and so much near experience to broaden the conversation from Prop 16 to the broader topics of race relations and discrimination. Nancy, what did we learn this year, given everything we've watched and seen and experienced?
Sure, I think you're right. There's just been a lot of things that have happened and a lot of things to learn. And I know for me, and partly because the data was really interesting to me around, one, the race relations components from February, when we first started the polling, into July, where we saw definitely an increase in awareness around discrimination against different communities. And I think that awareness piece, that opening of eyes around what is, and I think has been mentioned on this call around systemic racism, sometimes and I believe it begins with also an awareness that it's there, an awareness of the discrimination. And I think around COVID-19 for the Asian and Pacific Islander community, it's been really it's been because of some of the things that are said around the origins of it, because of the way it's addressed as being really a Chinese flu. I think it has really increased anti-Asian violence from more more active violence versus also microaggressions. And so I think that increase has also made more people aware that we are experiencing discrimination again as well, not because of the uptick, but that it was always there and that this maybe allowed for it to be seen. I think these distinctions are important because it helps us address them. Similar to what I mentioned earlier, how do we address things? We're just arguing that it's happening, but now we have a way to measure that there is discrimination across the board. We're feeling it as a community, and I think it will help us to inform the solutions. And I think I appreciated that Assistant Chief Arcos had shared some of the solutions their department had. I think it's informing those solutions with the rest of us too, and what we're seeing, because it's clear we're seeing discrimination across the board in our communities. And I think it's important for us to continue to have those conversations around solutions that fit us.
Nancy, thank you so much. It is an awful lot to process looking back. I think about the conversations, Helen, that we had back in January and February when we first began talking about taking on these topics. I don't know about you, but I don't think I understood exactly what we were getting ourselves into. But if you look back at the year, I know that for all the lessons we've learned, that there's some in particular that you've extracted from the poll results, which have been particularly instructive. And I'm wondering if you might be able to share those with the group we have gathered with us today.
Absolutely. So first of all, I agree with you, Dan. Who could have predicted this? And it was, I will say you're a little bit of a fortune teller, Dan, because you brought us all together. And what started off as a poll about the primary elections in California and understanding how race mattered in those conversations has really developed in an opportunity for us to dig deep about how discrimination is throughout our system, to really talk about solutions around policing. And unfortunately, because of COVID-19, we had the heavy lift to start really digging deep and understanding how race and ethnicity mattered in our healthcare system and in economic well-being. What I mean by that is that we all knew, especially Hope through our economic status of report of Latinas, that Latinas were in a very vulnerable state coming into COVID-19. Even though we saw great strides in healthcare reform and ensuring more Latinas from 30% back 20 years ago to now to 13% do not have insurance, we're still the highest group that does not have health insurance. We also know that Latinas were doubly impacted by COVID-19, one, either because we were frontline workers and that contributed to the cases of COVID-19 in the Latino and Latina community to be at 60% when we make 39% of the population, because we had to show up to work because we were considered essential workers. And we were also in the industries most impacted by the layoffs, the economic downturn. So that was a double impact on our community. Lastly, what we saw in the last poll that we did around COVID-19 specifically was that Latinos and Latinas overwhelmingly said that their state of affairs, how they were doing, was much worse off economically than when we started in February. But not surprising, they didn't believe the worst was yet to come. I interpreted that because the worst is already here. Our community is suffering. We are seeing double-digit numbers of COVID-19 cases in the Latino and Latina community, and the economic downturn has been devastating, as I've mentioned. So that's been very telling, because what this poll has allowed us to do was lift up the perceptions and the behaviors and the concepts and the opinions that Latinas and Latinos are having around this time, and to really call to attention that our system was already weak going into a pandemic. And it also provides us with the ability to have the discussions and push forward solutions so that not only do we survive this pandemic, but that we strengthen and thrive during the next, as we move out of it. And thriving is important. We cannot be in just a survival mode moving forward. I will add very quickly when it comes to race relations and the conversations that we started seeing develop from the poll in July through now in the last poll in November. As has been mentioned, police reform was one of the key questions that we asked in July. And what we found was very informative about how we message regarding police reform. We saw there was no support, even in the African American and Latino community, for messaging around defund the police. But there was overwhelming support for reforms, just as Assistant Chief Arcos has talked about that they're going through, around ensuring that police officers that were convicted or seen as having records of police brutality be removed from the force. We knew that there was strong support for more accountability in our policing. So we learned from this that message and narrative and who the messenger is also very important in our community.
Helen, thank you so much. I do want to, I've been watching the comments that have been coming in through the chat function, and we're getting some really good questions. And for anyone else who would like to submit a question, please do. And we'll move from my questions to yours in just a couple of minutes. But one of them is just something I want to clarify. One of our audience members asks, I think, a very appropriate and understandable question about whether we would benefit from having a panelist representing the Black Lives Matter movement on the panel. And the answer is, of course we would. But when this coalition came together, I think we all recognized that all of the communities represented here, the Asian Pacific, the Latina community, the African American community, all are represented by a tremendous number of very worthwhile and very admirable and very impactful organizations. And so for the fact, for example, that HOPE is part of our coalition and not the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Foundation or any number of other quality organizations representing the Latino and Latina community is not a reflection on them, but just our efforts to make sure that a range of voices is heard. And so by that same token, Michael Lawson represents not just his organization, the Los Angeles Urban League, but he's been a leader in his community and in our broader community for many, many years. And so while there are any number of other organizations that we welcome to the dialogue going forward, our functional coalition and panel group, we do rely on representatives of each community. So Michael, no pressure on you to speak for everyone. But I would ask you, not just on behalf of the African American community, but more broadly, given your experience over the years, what did you learn this year watching the remarkable events of 2020 as they've unfolded?
Thank you very much, Dan, for this opportunity. I would say that this was a remarkable year in a lot of different ways. The confluence of events that just happened all at once. You saw COVID-19 have a more devastating impact on Black and Latino residents than anyone else, which made clear the systemic discrimination in healthcare and so on and so forth. The murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. All of this came, not only were these events publicized, but you have to give credit to, and I'm glad you brought up Black Lives Matter, the work that organizations like that Black Lives Matter has done and other similar organizations. They started this work years ago. And as you can see, their message had worldwide impact. And it's important that we listen to uh, the recommendations, the demands of an organization such as Black Lives Matter. And I do not claim to represent Black Lives Matter because they are who they are, and they are an essential part of the fabric of citizens within this community. And make no mistake, I respect them. And I would tell you that we would not be where we are now without them. Whether you agree with the term defund the police or not, they got the conversation going that there needs to be more than just a diversification of the population within police departments across the country. We need to look deeper into what these organizations are paid to do, and look at all aspects of it. They are a very vital voice in all of this. I would welcome this to being on them being on this panel. But make no mistake, what the conversations that they have forced us to, very difficult conversations they forced us to be a part of, are important conversations that need to be discussed. And these decisions won't be made overnight. There will have to be a lot of discussions. There's a lot of pushback, as you well know, not just within the community, but within the police department itself. So this will not happen overnight. But make no mistake, we are moving the arc of the arc toward justice, the arc of history toward justice, and they are a big part of it. I'm not sure what else to say about that, other than this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that's going to happen before the end of the year, before the end of the next decade. But we are moving the needle, and we need all parties at the table in order to do that.
Michael, you're exactly right. And let me echo and reinforce that very last point for all of you who've chosen to join us today. These are three amazing organizations, but we recognize, as I said earlier, and as Michael just alluded to, that there's a whole range of incredible organizations involved in all of these three communities and many, many others as well that are not represented as part of this relatively limited panel discussion. We look at our polling, and I know I speak for Helen and Nancy and Michael on this point. We look at our polling as a jumping off point, and we look at it as an opportunity to build stronger relationships between LA's many, many, many diverse communities. And so if you're part of another organization representing one of these communities or others, or if you are simply a civic-minded Angelino who wants the most diverse community in the history of the planet Earth to thrive and succeed, we welcome you. And we'd ask you to contact Hope or Cause or Urban League. And there's nothing we'd love more than to integrate you into our efforts going forward. So Chief Arcos, I want to bring you back into this conversation. And I'd like to ask you the same question. You touched on it a little bit in your first answer, but just to dig a little bit deeper, looking back at this year, looking back at the challenges you faced, not just as a member of LAPD, but as an individual and a member of the community, with COVID, with protests, with the elections, what have, as you mentioned earlier, you've been on the force since 1988, you've seen a lot, you've learned a lot. What did you learn this year in this unique 2020 experience that we've all gone through together?
Well, to answer a great question that would really require a very long answer, because I've actually had to answer that question a number of times through some after action reports, both through the National Police Foundation and a couple other private groups that have been contracted by the city and the Board of Police Commissioners. But, I think what I want to make sure is that I phrase this response with that, for me, that trust is very fragile in this policing profession. And all the work that we've been doing over the last decades again, it speaks to it only takes one incident. But I've learned a number of things on the impact that this profession has with its communities it serves. And there's been a number of calls, again, for social justice reforms, police accountability, the police brutality, excessive force, et cetera. We hear that loud and clear. And every good cop wants a bad cop out of their department. That's universal. That goes without saying. One of the things that I'd speak to, I think, to try and give some context, though, is that we did hear that in this kind of perfect storm of issues that are going on is, what do you want your police department to do? What do you want them to be engaged in? Again, the social service providers that need to be out there 24/7 are not. Police and fire are out there 24/7. Police officers are engaged in work they're not fully trained and equipped to do. And that has to be answered. We are looking at alternative services to dispatch, different ways to do work where police officers are not the primary responder. We need to, again, put that emphasis and onus on our elected officials and other government entities to make sure that those services are out there and provided for those people that are experiencing mental illness, people experiencing homelessness, drug addictions, alcohol addictions, you name it. The entire spectrum of social services needs to be out there, but it needs to be supported. And it just can't be a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 job. Our communities deserve better. So that's definitely one aspect that we have heard that needs to change. We have a number of committees working with our city council on what that's going to look like. It also has to be socialized because, again, our communities, our citizens are used to picking up the phone and calling 911 and expecting the police to be there for every call. We have to start filtering and vetting out those type of calls that does not require a uniformed armed police officer to be at that call. Those things can quickly escalate, and those are the optics that we're trying to make sure that we are mitigating and not incurring additionally. Working in a COVID environment for this police department also had to change the way we look at our interactions with the police, with the communities that we serve, which really does account for that personal touch. We need to be there in person. We haven't been able to do a lot of the programs that we've been able to do. So that is also something we've had to rethink. We've closed our police stations where people feel safe harbor, or also to come there to get answers to the things that they are dealing with in their neighborhoods. All those things we've had to adjust to through meetings like this, like Zoom, WebEx, et cetera, to reach our communities that we serve. But I think just to kind of to recap, those are things that we have heard loud and clear about our role and our responsibility. This issue of defund or realign money that is given to policing, I think it's a very important topic. I think it's where do you want that money to go, that it's going to be realigned from your policing services. Is it going to go to those services that are going to support those other aspects that not to be dealt with, that you don't have to call your police department? We need to stay true to our basic core function of providing service on radio calls, 911 calls, et cetera. And so that's, again, how do you look at that? Because when we get out of this, and we'll recover from this COVID, in order to revitalize and re-energize this great city of ours, people are going to require and depend on public safety. And what is public safety going to look like when we do pass this terrible, terrible virus that we're all experiencing? How it's impacted us all. Our own department, we've lost our 3rd family member this past week. Sergeant Fred Cueto died from COVID-related illness. So it's hit us all. And lastly, Dan, I'll leave you with this, because this is, again, maybe another question, is just the surge, not only in the virus that's going on today, but the surge in violent crime that's happening across this country. This city has never seen these numbers in a decade. We are plus 72 homicides today than we were last year. We are plus 300 more shooting victims than we were last year. There's so much that's going out there, the frustration, the depression, the loneliness that's going on out there is really driving a number of factors that we need to all get together and come together and offer some solutions. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Chief Arcos. I think that was a very, very helpful framing, not just for the department, but for all of us. So we're very grateful to you. I have more questions that I'd love to ask our panel, but I'm watching some really phenomenal questions come in through the chat and Q&A functions. And so what I'm going to try to do is to combine a few of them to give our panelists a chance to answer as many of your queries as possible. One just very quickly that's come in, which I can answer quickly before we go on to others, is we were asked, did redirecting funds from police to more social welfare programs resonate with poll respondents? And the answer is emphatically yes. And as Helen mentioned, the respondents by very strong numbers did not support the idea of defunding the police by removing police funds altogether, but did, as all of our panelists have talked about in one way or another, did support the idea of taking some of those funds to redirect them toward mental health response teams, to social services, to that type of redeployment. One question that's come up, and it's been phrased a few different ways, and I'll apologize in advance to whichever panelist has to answer it first, because it's fascinating but challenging. The question I'll ask of all of you who'd like to take a shot at it is, do you believe that the American dream still exists? Do you believe that hard work and perseverance can overcome obstacles and lead to success in life? We've faced a lot of challenges that have shaken a lot of people's belief in that basic principle. My question for anyone who'd like to take it on, any of the four of you, is, does that dream still exist? Maybe to put a slightly different frame on it, what will it take to reassure more of our fellow Angelenos that it still does, if you believe in fact that is the case? I see all four faces saying, Schnur, if you call on me first, I'm not going to forgive you. But Nancy, did you want to offer your thoughts?
Sure. I'll start, and then I'm excited to also hear what my peers have to say. And I think too, for me, I think about the question around my belief, and I think this is a really diverse response. I come from an immigrant family, immigrant communities. So much of my life is surrounded by people who came here because of the brand of America, which is that dream. And so I think it resonates from a meritocracy standpoint for some of our communities, but it also is that part of hope that I really believe in, which is also related to representation. I want to see myself reflected in all the ways that I'm diverse. And I think that that is the dream that my parents followed here. So I think that, I don't know that it matters if I personally believe. I think our communities came with some expectations, and some of them are met and some of them are not, depending on how the cards fall, I guess. But for me, it's about, as a second generation Asian American, that I believe that I can move things towards it, that I believe in equity, because of my past and my community's past, and that dream for me means that means there is that fairness. And I think that's important. And that's how we, not just as Angelenos, but I think nationally, with our view of diversity, which is different than almost all places in the world, because of our history of immigrants, means that we have to find a way that does include us. So I hope that I'm happy to hand it over to whoever else.
Helen, how about?
Yeah, okay.
Helen, how about?
I think I would be fired if I was running an organization called Hope and not believing in the American dream. But I would also say, I also believe in the California dream. And both are unique to who we are as leaders and the communities that we represent. To Nancy's point, the Latino community has a large immigrant population that comes here because of the promise of a strong democracy, the promise that our children will advance if they do work hard and are given the opportunity. And it's incumbent on all of us as leaders, as citizens, as residents, to ensure that opportunity is there. So I would take it a step further. It's not only about believing in a dream, it's about being protectors and stewards of this dream of true opportunity for all and for fairness, as Nancy has also stated very eloquently. And I think it is important to remember that there is a California dream. We're one of the only states that also kind of combines an American dream with a California dream. And that opportunity to create fairness, to have a sense of the impossible is possible, I think it's unique to being a Californian. And I know at Hope we work really hard for Latinas to see themselves not only being part of that dream and that fabric, but also being the dreamers and the innovators that the state and this country needs.
Thank you, Helen. And I want to apologize to Chief Arcos because it looked like you were volunteering to weigh in also. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think we'd be eager to hear your thoughts on this
I'm
question.
glad you did because, you know, Helen and Nancy, you're both so inspirational, and thank you for your remarks. And, you know, I am an eternal optimist, and I do believe in both the American dream and the California dream. You know, I'm from a family of immigrants that came to this country with that dream. You know, they were painters, they were gardeners, they were wallpaper hangers. They just did the work. And one of the things that I've tried to carry on in my messaging and my supporting and through mentoring others is to always remind people again that representation does matter, and to tell your story. Tell your story to these kids in these communities who see no hope, who see no way out, and tell them what you've overcome from adversity, from people who told you you will never amount to anything. And I'm proud to say on this department that we have a collection of amazing men and women from all ethnic backgrounds and all cultures that can share that story. And, you know, we are doing a better job today than I thought we were 20 years ago about sharing those stories. Just yesterday, we had an Instagram post on Sergeant Leticia Ruiz, who came again, was pregnant, teenage pregnancy, homeless, selling tamales on the corner, and then went back to school and got her BA, got her master's degree, and today she's sitting ready to become a lieutenant on this department. Those are the things that fill me with such pride and joy about what makes up this department, how we serve, and how we reflect this city. So I believe it exists, and it does come from people like us with our experiences to continue to promote and to inspire that way forward for others.
Thank you, Chief Arcos. Michael, you've had the advantage of having an extra few minutes to consider and reflect on that question. So it better be good.
It's hard to articulate an answer that is more impactful than the ones that have come before me. I would just say, yes, of course, we believe in the American dream. There's no question about it, but we also recognize that it is not a level playing field. That it's like being in a race, and you know, you're starting at the starting line, and other people are starting at the 50-yard line for no reason other than their race, other than their ethnicity. And it's and unless we address, I mean, that is my illustration of systemic racism. And unless we address that, there are so many talented people who will not achieve that. And understand that we, as a nation, are leaving some very talented and brilliant people behind who would help this nation become even better. The talent that is represented on this panel, and the people that we serve, these are bright, talented, hardworking people who are not given an opportunity to achieve that American dream. And yes, we applaud those of us who have made it. I am one of those. born in Arkansas, but made it to not only Harvard Law School, but an ambassador position in the Obama administration. Yes, I applaud, I honor those people on whose shoulders I stand, but it shouldn't have been that hard. And we need to recognize that we are leaving talent behind, that the dream that is the American dream will not be achieved if we don't use all of the resources that are available, which is primarily the talent that's represented on this panel. I am optimistic. We will keep fighting the fight, and we will keep doing what we can to eliminate these artificial barriers to success. And we will achieve this American dream. Absolutely. We have a female vice president-elect for the first time in our history. She is not only female, but she clicks boxes for African-American, Southeast Asian, and just being one of the smartest people in any room that she's in. You cannot say that the American dream is not achievable with and not recognize that it is achievable. And she is an embodiment of that, just as Barack was an embodiment of that, and others. But it shouldn't be as hard as it is, and we have to change that. You're on mute.
Thank you. All four of you, I was so awestruck I forgot to take myself off mute. I think all four of you offered just an extraordinarily helpful perspective, not just encouragement, but a realistic assessment of what needs to be done in order to make that American dream happen for everyone. Michael and I have talked about this before. I don't think any of us knew going in that the arc of the universe would bend toward justice, but would take so long for that to happen. And I think what I heard from Nancy, from Helen, from Chief Arcos, from Michael, is that those who persist, and there are those who will need additional support in order to get there. As Helen mentioned at the beginning, I have the privilege of teaching extraordinary people, university students. And one of the things, and Chief Arcos addressed this in a separate context, is the COVID challenge. The pandemic has really laid bare the extent to which some of the most deserving in our communities require and deserve extra support in order to succeed. I have wonderful students, incredible students, who are able to log on every morning from their own bedroom or study, where they can have a environment to listen and learn and participate without any distractions. I have other students who log on from the kitchen in their house and don't want to unmute themselves to ask a question in class because their siblings or their parents or their grandparents are living their lives in that same constrained space. I have some students who aren't able to watch class at 2 o'clock on a weekday afternoon, and instead they park their cars outside of Starbucks or McDonald's to cop the Wi-Fi service so they can participate in an education late at night. And that's not fair. And every single one of you made the point in a somewhat different way. But the answer, which all of you have articulated for us, I think just phenomenally, is not to give up and not say the American dream cannot be achieved, but not only can it be achieved for every one of those young people, but not only do they benefit from the additional support and the additional direction and the additional guidance and additional resources, but we all benefit from providing them with that support and those resources, because when they realize the American dream, that makes it that much more attainable for the rest of us also. I apologize for my diatribe. Every once in a while, I'll take moderator's prerogative, even if I can't help myself. But we do have just a few minutes left. And so maybe I'd ask each of the four of you, and unfortunately, I'm going to need, if you can offer this in a minute or so, is in addition to the very poignant observations that you just offered, what advice would you offer to a civic-minded Angelino who's taken the time, like our guests have today, to participate in a conversation like this one? What advice would you offer them on how to best make a difference, not only to help themselves achieve the American dream, to help the others we've talked about achieve that dream as well? And of course, you get to offer that advice in a minute or less, which is totally unfair, but I'll ask you to anyway. And Michael, since you had extra time to think before the last unfair question, why don't we start with you on this one? What advice would you offer to all of us on how to best proceed toward achieving that dream for all of us?
Thank you very much. I think you just get up and work at it every single day. We had a model when I was working at my law firm that every morning I would get up and put on my armor and fight the fight. There's much to be done. There's much that needs to be done. There's much that can be done. The last election is an example of that. Is not going to happen overnight, but just keep working at it. And when you see the people on this panel and all the people who are out there working to make things change, when you look at the hundreds of thousands and millions of people worldwide who protested after George Floyd's murder, you have to be optimistic about what we can do. And that's where I am.
Thank you so much, Michael. Chief Arcos, would you like to offer any advice for our audience from your perspective?
Yeah, sure, Dan. I think that you kind of captured it at the beginning. I mean, just get involved, make a difference, but find your passion. And in finding your passion, find your voice and be that strength in your communities. If not you, who? I mean, I think you just can't just sit back and point fingers and complain. I think the way this country has responded to the injustices that they've called out and police accountability is a great representative of this question. You can make a difference, and it starts with you. And again, I think that passion and those beliefs are also part of the prior question about the dream, following that dream, your beliefs, your way, your path, your journey. It starts with that passion and making a difference in the lives of others, because it does matter.
And I think what you both offer, Michael, in terms of persistence, Chief Arcos, in terms of focus, is exactly right. I share with my students a quote from the late Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. He gave a famous commencement speech at Stanford University back when he was still with us. And he talked to the students about putting a dent in the universe. And what I love about that quote is often when you're young, you hear about how you can change the world. And I think what we realize as we get older is the world's a pretty big place. And changing the world is a pretty formidable task. But if you find one particular spot and pick up a crowbar and put the dent in the universe, if all of us do that together, then collectively we change the world. Nancy Yap, how about you? What advice would you offer to our group gathered here today before we go our separate ways?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of collective impact, I feel like there is such power in all of us working together. But right now I'm going to talk a little bit just about supporting the nonprofit leaders as well. I think there's a lot of amazing organizations out there. And even myself, I'm just so impressed by my peers in our sector. But there's a lot on us right now. I think the gaps are being shown, not just in our data, but even in our conversations around what's happening to our communities, in our neighborhoods. There are gaps that are really starting to show and surface, and solutions that are needed. And our communities that are closest, our leaders that are close to those communities, there are other kinds of fatigue that are happening right now. And it comes from a community of professionals. And I will say the nonprofit sector is often under-resourced, especially in our communities. And so just be mindful, think about this giving season, where you're passionate, not just for your time, but also think about where you want to provide support financially, where you can do some of the lift and support for your leaders in the community. And I think that will help us kind of go even further. So.
Thank you, Nancy. And as all of you may have seen in the chat box, Maya Gomez-Ocades from HOPE has sent out the links to all three of the websites for the organizations, community organizations represented on this panel. And to second Nancy's point, let's think of Giving Tuesday as a nice start. Helen, we're just at 11:15, so you get the last word of advice to offer to our group, if you can.
My big word of advice or concept is create a relay team. This is important to develop not only our youth as future leaders, but to be a support of each other as peers. Have a dream is to make sure that it's transferred to others and that there's buy-in and equity for everyone. And the one way we can do that is to be good stewards and create a big team, a big relay team, because this is a race, often an unfair race. But if we have good people on our team, if we're bringing our youth, and if we enter the 21st century with smart new innovation, I am so confident and obviously very hopeful as we move forward.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, and all of your colleagues at HOPE for being with us today and for all the good work you do. Thank you, Michael Lawson, for the leadership you provide, not just at the Los Angeles Urban League, but for our entire community. Thank you so much to Assistant Chief Robert Arcos from the Los Angeles Police Department for taking the time to join us today and for all the work that you and your colleagues do to keep us and our families and our communities safe, even during difficult times. Thank you, Nancy Yap, to you and to the entire team that you have, the incredible team that you have at Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. We're grateful, we're lucky to have you. And thanks so much to Tricia Muse and all of her colleagues at SoCalGas for bringing us together today for this important conversation. We're flattered that you would reach out to us. We're grateful to have the chance to talk with you and your colleagues, and we'll hope to have a chance to continue this in the future. And finally, thanks so much to all of you who joined us today for this very important conversation. We hope you all have a very happy holiday season. And we hope through any one of the organizations that was involved today, we hope you'll reach out and decide to join us as we continue to work to make sure that American dream is available for every single Angelino, every single Californian, every single human being. Thanks again, everyone. We'll look forward to continuing our good work with you in the new year.